Aninsigo, Kachi Miigwech, Kaje Manitou, Makwa Masayat, Nindishnakaz, Anishinaabe Kisakus First Nation, Nindonji, Makwa Dodom. Good morning, everyone. What I've said to you in my Soto language is my traditional name, and that I give thanks to the Creator for that. In my community, in my nation, it's my uncle's responsibility to give me my traditional name. Makwa Masayat means I'm walking with bears. I'm from Kisakus First Nation. It's a Saulteaux community on the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border. And so in every way that it's possible to be a visitor here on the unceded and occupied territory of the Musqueam people. I am, and I'm very grateful to the community to make this space available for all of us to be here as guests or as uninvited guests, as it may be. The other thing that I said to you is that I'm from the Bear Clan. I'd like to thank Tracy for extending an invitation for me to come and speak with you today. I think that the work that you're doing is some of the most important work that exists. And when Tracy was reading out where I've been and what I've been doing, one thing that she didn't say, and that isn't in my bio, is that some of my first memories are of being about 3 years old, standing with my mother and my little brother, who was an infant at the time, and seeing these men with fuzzy hats on their head and long yellow stripes on the side of their pants come to our house and to escort us to a really pretty car that was in our driveway, and it had red and blue lights on the roof. And those men took us to Grandma's house. So I would have been 3, my brother would have been a newborn. And I remember being afraid and thinking that maybe we had done something wrong. I didn't know why they were in our house. I didn't know why we were in the car. And I remember when I got out and I could see my grandparents standing on the front step waiting for us. And I remember looking at the man and he said, "You know, there's really nothing to be afraid of. You're going to be okay." He said, "Is there anything I can do?" He must have had children at home. And I said, "It would be really nice if you would turn those pretty lights on." And so in my grandparents' driveway, he turned on the red and blue flashing lights. And I remember thinking, wow, he's a really nice guy. And I remember skipping up the walk and thinking everything was going to be fine. And I remember the next day we were home and my mom put a turkey in the oven and she was cooking. And I remember saying to her, "Why are we back here?" And she didn't really have an answer. And I remember at that time, at such a young age, thinking, when I grow up, this is never going to happen to me. 3 years old. I can remember that like it was yesterday. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happened since then and what happened a long time before that. And I'm going to start by asking the person at the back to bring up the PowerPoint that I have. Now, am I able to control that from up here? And I point it where? Oh, okay. Isn't technology great when it works? Oh. And to bring this up. Okay, so I've done the acknowledgement. I want to say a word to Indigenous women that are in this room. At this point, I'm 57 years old and I know a lot of people through a lot of work history and community connections. And I'm here to say that in my circle, of very privileged people that teach at universities. I don't know one Indigenous woman that's not been sexually or physically assaulted. I don't know one. And that's an indictment about our society and what's happened to us. And we're not the only ones. The things that I'm going to be sharing today are going to mean maybe different things to Indigenous women in this room than maybe to non-Indigenous women that have not had this experience. And I want them to be ready. I don't want them to be surprised. And I want them to know that I'm going to talk about some hard things today. And I want them to know that we're going to be okay. I'm going to start with some self-care for all of you in this room. And to remember that I care for you and I care that you do well in your work, because just like me being that little kid, there's lots of little children out there that are depending on you to do good work and to do it in good ways. A lot of families out there too. And I want to start with a prayer song. It's by a guy named Doug Spotted Eagle. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to close your eyes. And I want you to think about those people in your life that have made lasting impressions on you. People that when you wake up in the middle of the night, it's them that you think about. And I want you to think about the people that have helped us all to be here at this time and place. And it's only for 4 minutes. So it's a sunrise prayer song, and it's to give thanks that we're all here today.
Shalchin Nijanko Bahayan Nijanko Shense Kiestu Nijanko Shizad Alondo Shilaj Rajon Benashado Shikiete Rajon Benashado Sitsit Lalte Rajonto Shikit Ate Hojondo Altmate Hojon Benashado Hojon Bedenstedo Hojon Nashado Lil Hojon Hastling Hojon Hastling Hojon Hastling Hojon Hastling
So that was a sunrise prayer and song by Doug Spotted Eagle. What you're seeing up on the monitor right now is a map of Canada with the treaties identified. And you can see on the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border is Treaty 4. That's where I'm from. Here in British Columbia, most of the landmass is not covered by treaty except for Tsawwassen and Niska, Treaty 8. But about 90% of our province is not covered by treaty, and that means special things. And I liken it to somebody coming to my house, knocking at my door, and saying, you have a really nice place, I'd like to come in. And then they decide to move them and their family in. And they say that I don't have to leave, but I have to live in the bathroom. That's the amount of space. So our people have gone from having 100% ownership of this land to 0.02% that is now set aside for us in reserves in this country. When our people first met the newcomers, we agreed to share, but we didn't know that 99.8% of the land and 0.02% was how the sharing was going to happen. Here, the Musqueam do not have a treaty with Canada, and that means in effect that basically we're all squatting on their land. And I want to acknowledge the people that have made that possible. This is what I'm going to talk with you about today, and it's in your agenda. I'm not going to go over this in particular order, but there are a number of things that I'd like to do. And I really want to assist you. If you've come out of the Canadian education system about the last 30 years or so, probably you didn't receive a lot of education around Indigenous issues in your education. And you may have received some since you've left. I'm going to help with that understanding. I'm going to help us to start conversations and actions about ways to better support Indigenous people from our perspective. Not what anybody else thinks is in our best interest, but from our perspective. I'm going to talk about some specific human rights frameworks. I thought it was important. It's not just Shelley standing up here talking about this, but this is from the part of a motion from the City of Vancouver, and I don't know if people have seen it, but it's June 25th, 2014. And what they said was, underlying all the other truths spoken during the year of reconciliation is the truth that the modern city of Vancouver was founded on traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and that these territories were never ceded through treaty, war, or surrender. Now you think, how can that happen? How can that happen? And because I was at UBC and have much extended family and community members that I know and love at Musqueam, spent a lot of time down there. And I asked that question. And they said at the time of contact, their people were numbered at 30,000 people in this area. 30,000 people. And with the coming of disease and with the coming of newcomers and all of the things that brought with it in terms of colonization, their numbers went down to 100 people. And I think about, a city the size of Vancouver, say 1 million people, in a very short period of time, what would happen to our governance systems, our social systems, our legal systems, our economic systems, if 1 million people were reduced by the same amount? And that would be to take us down to 3,300 people from 1 million. The kind of devastation that would wreak in our communities. And that's what's happened here. That's not where the story ends. Musqueam today is back to about 16 or 1700 people from that low of 100 of almost being wiped off the map. And so when we're working in communities, it's really important, I think, for us to understand from the people's perspective what has happened there that has brought so much change in a very short period of time, 250 years for the Musqueam people. What's happened in the communities that you're working in? And if you haven't asked those questions, I hope that when you leave here, you go back and you do. Standing up here talking to you about these very personal things is really difficult. And when I'm talking with students that are coming out of high school or first couple of years of university, they don't have a lot of understanding. They don't have a lot of knowledge about this. And this is really deeply personal work for me because it's not just a theoretical concept that I'm talking about. I'm talking about what happened to my family. I'm talking about what happened to my community. And it requires an unsettling, a disruption. If students coming into my classroom think that they're not going to be unsettled or disrupted, they quickly learn that that's not going to be the case. And it is very disrupting for them because for many of the students coming to university, they've come from a place of not knowing and not seeing and not understanding from my perspective the way I see Canada and the way that things have happened here in Canada. So it creates some tension and it really uncovers racism and bias in ways that students maybe aren't prepared for. And it really is an unsettling of our shared history because I think Canadians as a general population like to think that we're the peacekeepers that go around the world. We're the peacekeepers that bring calm to chaos and conflict and violence. And nobody really talks about the violence that's happened here for hundreds of years to our people. And there's a shutting down sometimes that happens when we introduce those notions that Canada isn't maybe the Canada that you know from our perspective. So it can be challenging, and so this morning might be a bit challenging too. But it's really important that we have these conversations, honest, open, transparent conversations, where you talk about your history, your understanding of what's happened in this country, and we have an opportunity to talk about what's happened from our perspective. There was an opportunity when I was at UBC to go and have breakfast with President. And he invited staff and faculty and students. And so I showed up, and there was about 150 of us on the UBC campus, beautiful campus, to talk about what might make UBC a better place for incoming students. And I used to be an executive director, and so when I got invited by the president, I went with a briefing note, and I had all my notions that I wanted to talk to him about identified. And when it came time for him to say, okay, what are people's ideas? You could hear crickets in the room. Nobody said anything. And I thought, how many opportunities do we ever get to get this guy in a room and tell him what we really think? And so I spoke up and I said, Mr. President, what would UBC do if the Musqueam Indian Band representatives that live 7 kilometers away walked down to your office one day and said, UBC, you've been squatting on our land for 100 years, and here's your bill, your invoice for back rent for 100 years. What would you do? And he turned white. And he was a South Asian guy at the time. And he said, well, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, do we have an employment strategy? Are there any openings? First, look to the local population. And do we have tuition waivers here at UBC for our Indigenous students from Musqueam that might want to come here? And I was the only voice talking. I said, children in care have tuition waivers. And as an employee here, if I had any children under 25 years old, they would all be entitled to a 4-year tuition-free degree at UBC because their mom works here. And that's extended to every faculty member and every staff member here at UBC. And I know for a fact that there's 360 people sitting on the Musqueam education list. And even if they can afford to send 3 or 4 people to school every year, it's going to be 60 years before that wait list is decimated. Never mind all the people coming behind it. He didn't have anything to say, and then one of my colleagues from fisheries, a man, stood up and he said, I don't think that's enough. I don't think they should just have tuition waivers. I think if they come and they get into, say, fisheries, for example, they should be identified with a mentor from a faculty position that's going to guide them and help them through their 4-year program. And there was another woman that spoke up, and she said she was from the president's office, which kind of took him by surprise. And she said, you know, I don't think that's enough either. She said, I'm a single woman and I have that tuition waiver in my collective rights, but I don't have any children. And so I'd like to transfer my tuition waiver to a Musqueam person. That was amazing opportunity for the president to hear from us. And what that showed to me is that even though I was the only Indigenous person in the room, there are allies, and they made themselves present and they made themselves accountable. And the weight that that takes off the shoulders of an Indigenous person when another person that is not Indigenous speaks up was a huge lesson to me. And I hope that's something that you'll take away from here. This is Annie. And this is a map of Nunavut. And in 2008, I was part of something called the Governor General's Leadership Conference. It's an amazing opportunity. If you're under 40 years old, look it up. Because what happens is that you compete with other people for about 250 positions and for a 2-week conference. And they ask you which part of Canada do you want to go to for 2 weeks to meet with government, to meet with all kinds of people from labor, from academia, from social services, from support services. And it's paid for by the Governor General's Conference. 2 weeks. So they flew us to Ottawa. I joined this one in Nunavut. And we were met with the elders in a little place called Igloolik, Nunavut. And you can see it on the right-hand side. And this is the lady Annie that I got to sit beside. And she said to me, Shelley, I'm going to tell you a story, and when you're in front of a lot of people, I want you to share this story. This is mine, and it's my gift to you. And Annie told me that when she was a young woman, she was living in the Western Arctic, and she married a man from the Eastern Arctic, and that was in the 1940s. And when she went to the Eastern Arctic, she was met by some people who gave on her wedding day, her husband, a disc that he was to wear around his neck all the time. And it was like a social insurance number, but it was given to all the men in Nunavut at that time, before it was called Nunavut. And Annie, she was wearing a tunic and some leggings. And she was at that time 92 years old. And she stood by the table, and she lifted up her tunic and she pulled down her leggings so that I could see her hip. And on her hip was 9 letters and numbers tattooed into her skin. And I said to her, Annie, where did you get that? And she said, Shelley, it came from the government people when I got married. They gave the men the discs, but they tattooed numbers on our women. I've done a lot of research, and short of asking for freedom of information from the Government of Canada, I can't find any information about that, but that's not surprising because Canada would want to suppress what they were doing to women in the Arctic, Indigenous women in the Arctic, in the 1940s when they were sending our troops overseas to fight against Germans. And the only other people that I've heard about getting tattooed by government were Jewish people. And that happened in our country. So I think it's fair to say that the Canada that I know as an Indigenous woman might be a little bit different than the Canada that you know. I just want to help people to remember the Convention on the Prevention of Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This, any of the following acts committed to with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Justice Murray Sinclair, he talked about cultural genocide after he'd finished his report on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm here to say, as an Indigenous woman, Canada has met all of these conditions in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. From my perspective, they've met that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about establishing new relationships, but there's a lot that has to be restored and renewed and repaired and returned from my perspective. So I've already talked about the lands that were formerly owned by us. I've talked about, I'm going to talk about the Indian Act. And if you haven't heard of the Indian Act or you think it's something in the past, I'm here to say that it's alive and well today. Canada's Indian residential schools were, for over 120 to 150 years, our children were forcibly removed from our care by the government, by the church, and backed up by the muscle of the RCMP. And talk about the numbers of children that we have that are missing, that we don't know where they're buried or where they've gone. The 60 Scoop and the Millennium Scoop, again, where our children have been forcibly transferred from our care to non-Indigenous people and other care. I'm going to talk about Indian hospitals. Is there anybody in this room that has ever even heard about Indian hospitals? Safe to say maybe 20 people out of 420. I really encourage you to ask why your education system, this Canadian education system, has not prepared you with this information. When you're working with our very vulnerable people and you don't understand maybe some of the implications for those families that have experienced Indian hospitals in this country. Poor housing and a lot of contracts on reserve that went to the lowest bidder. Boil water advisories are missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Our high rates of incarceration, our overrepresentation in the child welfare system, and a lack of post-secondary funding. When I look around and I see Indigenous people still standing and fighting, I think that we must be the toughest people on this bloody planet. I think it's pretty clear that the Canadian government has thrown everything at us to ensure that we don't live, and yet we're still standing. I come from the prairies. If there's some reading that I can encourage you to take away, this is James Jaschuk's book from 2013. He's talking about Indigenous health and disease on the prairies. And he's talking about where we were forced into treaties and onto reserves at the point of starvation, where our families were given rotten meat, diseased animals, and food was withheld from us if we tried to counter any of the rules of the federal government. Thousands of our people died. And coming from the prairies, I can say that I don't think that our health on the prairies has ever recovered from that. I come from Treaty 4. You know what winter looks like in Saskatchewan? And our treaty was signed in September of 1874, just before winter, when the buffalo was gone and our people were starving, and we were promised food if we moved on to reserve. And so my great-grandfather was one of the signatories, and my grandmother was born about 20 years after we signed our treaty. And it was done at the point of a gun. It was not sitting down negotiating. We were going to die or we had to sign. And that was the decision they made. Now this next slide, for Indigenous people in the room, this may bring up issues for you. And I really encourage you to come and talk at lunchtime if it does. This is a depiction by Kent Monkman. It's called The Scream. And it talks about how our people viewed the RCMP and the church and the leadership at the time, and their ability to take our children away from us and send them to residential school, where many of us knew that they were going to be harmed there. And so when I think about our services and how we're going to decolonize them or indigenize them, I think that that really has to start with an acknowledgement of our inherent rights and our treaty rights and how those are enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, Section 35, and different international agreements. If people in this room have not read the 94 Calls to Action, I really encourage you from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to do that, to make that some of your reading. If we're going to move forward, then there has to be a recognition of all these historic and contemporary wrongs that are committed against Indigenous people in this country. And there's a need to redress that. And it isn't going to be easy, but it has to happen, and it has to happen in very frank conversations. Yes, there's intimate partner violence, but the systemic and the institutional violence is also something that we need to be talking about and understanding how that's come into our lives and what that means today. This is a quote. People can say, well, we didn't know about it. We didn't know that Indian residential schools, Canada had that policy. We didn't know what was happening in those schools. Just like today, people can say, yes, we know there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare system. There's an overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the jails. But we do know about it, and we have to ask, what are we doing about that? What are you doing? What am I doing? This is a quote from May 8th, 1909. It's from Dr. Peter Bryce, who was a doctor with the Ontario Health Commission. And he wrote to the superintendent, so the person that's now in Indigenous and Northern Affairs position, said, I believe the conditions are being deliberately created in our Indian residential schools to spread infectious diseases. The mortality rate among students often exceeds 50%. This is a national crime. He was let go from his position for making that aware and putting it in writing. So the person he was writing to, Duncan Campbell Scott, he wrote to an Indian agent here, Major McKay, in BC, April 12, 1910, so about a year later. He said, it's readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habiting so closely in the residential schools, and they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared toward a final solution of our Indian problem. 1910. Annie was tattooed in 1940. The last Indian residential school didn't close in this country until 1996 in Saskatchewan. And they knew that putting children with active TB in the bed next to a child without active TB was calculated to bring about the destruction of our people. 50% of our children that went didn't survive the education that they received. When you start thinking about people not trusting government officials, not trusting the RCMP, not trusting people in health, these are some of the reasons why. There were 139 of those schools deliberately funded by the government, state-sanctioned violence and abuse, starvation. They did medical experiments on our people and created substandard education levels. Not only that, it was enforced by the RCMP, and it was administered by churches. 139 across the country. What happened in my family is that my father is one of 9 children. He and his brother that's closest in age to them were sent to LeBret Residential School. His 2 older sisters were sent to a residential school in Alberta. 2 were sent to Ontario. 1 was sent to the Maritimes, and 1 was sent here in BC. There were 9 of them. It wasn't just separating children by floors in a residential school. In our family, they were separated by provinces, which completely distorted our family and had all kinds of implications. State-sanctioned violence. This is from an article. Does anybody remember where they were on June 11th, 2008? Anybody? I was sitting in the Northwest Territories in front of a little TV screen about this big to watch the apology from Stephen Harper in an airport lounge waiting for our next flight to Nunavut. And I was with 16 people in my group, and they sat in a horseshoe around me because that's what they could do as non-Indigenous people to support me that day. And as I sat there, I thought, what would this mean to my grandmother? What would this mean to my dad if they could be here? Grandma had already been dead 35 years by then. She never heard that. And when my dad learned it was coming on TV, he just went for a walk. This is Kathy Richardson from UVic. She wrote this article with Vicki Reynolds. And she's talking about her experience. She said, I watched my Prime Minister's official apology to Joe and his people for residential schools from a reserve with former residential school inmates. Everyone's crying. Some leave. It's too much to watch. As a Canadian with Métis, Cree, Gwich'in, Dene, and European ancestry, I watched this federal performance beside people who are visibly tormented by memories of state-imposed violence against children. Those are the parents and the grandparents of some of the children that you're working with today. Vicki writes, Vicki Reynolds, who's a non-Indigenous woman, said, my Prime Minister never asked me or other settler people if we were sorry, or what we were sorry for, or if we wanted to be accountable, or how we wanted to be accountable for this political violence. It's an empty apology given on my behalf that pretends to clean my slate, requiring me to acknowledge nothing and to do nothing. What does that apology mean to people in this room? What did that do for you? What changed in your life because of that apology? I think those are some questions that we need to start asking each other and asking ourselves. People said, well, I can't believe that Canada would do this. But then there was this guy in Mosby who was doing research for his PhD, and he came across this nutritional research and human biomedical experimentation that happened here in Canada between 42 and 52, when Annie was getting married. By some of Canada's leading nutrition experts, cooperation with various federal departments conducted on an unprecedented series of nutritional studies of Aboriginal community and children forced to attend in residential schools. So they had a captive population sample. The intent was to determine how little food Aboriginal people and children could survive on without starving to death. That was done in our country, on Indigenous people that couldn't leave residential schools and couldn't leave our reserves. And it occurred during the period where there was the establishment of the Nuremberg Code of Experimental Research Ethics done. This is our country, our peacekeeping country, as our people were away fighting in the war. This was what was happening to 6 communities and children in residential school. Now, we didn't know that was happening. In my family, all my dad and uncles and aunts talked about was how hungry they were all the time. And 2 of my aunts that were in Manitoba at the Brandon Residential School talked about going with other children to an experimental chicken farm that they had just down the road and catching live chickens and eating them because they were so hungry. We didn't know this kind of experimentation in between the federal government, provincial governments, was happening on our people. We just knew we were hungry. This is another book. If you've not read it and you're working with Indigenous people, this has to be required reading for you. Medicine Unbundled, A Journey Through the Minefields of Indigenous Healthcare. When you read this book by Gary Geddes, it's based here in BC, and he's talked with a lot of elders that were in the 3 Indian hospitals that were here in British Columbia. It will help you understand why Indigenous women and people in my family, especially, a lot of Indigenous women don't want to go to the doctor for Pap tests, don't want to go to the doctor for rape kits. don't want to go to the doctor, don't want to go to the dentist. My dad was one of those little kids at 7 years old that developed an abscess in his tooth. They sent students, dentistry students from the university in Regina out to the residential school, and they did surgery on his teeth at 7 years old with no anesthetic. Now, there's a reason my dad really doesn't like to go see dentists today. You'll understand more about how people say, well, I've heard stories about infected blankets being shared in our communities to bring about our destruction by the Canadian military, by the Canadian RCMP. Gary Geddes talks about how that was done in this province to make way for settlers coming here and the collateral damage that happened in our communities. Again, if you're working with Indigenous people, anything to do with healthcare, this is a must-read book for you. People may not know that there were about 122 Indian hospitals in this country. 3 were here in BC, in Prince Rupert, Nanaimo, and Sardis at Chilliwack. They were usually set up in decommissioned barracks, so the military, so more oversight on our people, and in the basements of hospitals. Now, when you've been in the hospital, what's usually in the basement of a hospital? Garbage, laundry, a morgue. Our people have very strong traditions, beliefs, and values around who can be around dead bodies and where those bodies and their spirit are going to go. So if you're an Indigenous person with those kind of beliefs, do you really want to go for medical treatment in the basement of a hospital next to a morgue? There are a lot of reasons that this was not a helpful thing, but we had segregated healthcare in this country for 30 years between the 1940s and 70s. And again, that's not part of your education, probably, that people are talking about. Maybe what you don't know too is there's a $1.1 billion class action lawsuit that's been filed against the Canadian government to provide compensation for victims in 29 of the hospitals, and they're listed there. All 3 in BC are part of that class action. Canada doesn't really want to talk about its policy of sterilization of Indigenous women, but it's a fact. And this book by Karen Stout talks about sterilization, and she talks about how killing people, sterilizing people, is really a way for the government to gain access to land and resources, and reducing the numbers of people in this country that the federal government has fiduciary and treaty responsibilities and obligations to. She talks about the Alberta Sexual Sterilization Act, and where 25% of those 2,800 women were sterilized against their will, and there was no free, informed, and prior consent. And this is really, really difficult history to listen to. And then I heard about Senator Yvonne Boyer in this month, who's launched a class action lawsuit and is underway because Indigenous women in this country are still coming forward with stories of being forcibly sterilized. And I want to take you back to the understanding about what genocide means from the UN Convention. Who here knows anything about Justice Gordon Ramsay? Does that name ring a bell for anybody in this room? Maybe about 50 people out of 420. Back in the day, I lived in Prince George, and I was a social worker, and I had a caseload of Indigenous children. And I'd asked for all the Indigenous children in that particular office to be with me rather than to be with other social workers. And that was because I was aware of the high rate of racism and bias against Indigenous people in that particular office, held by those particular social workers. And I was sitting one day with a 14-year-old Indigenous youth, and she started talking to me about this judge that was buying sex from girls and how violent he was, and how she had to appear in court the next month in front of him. He was a sitting provincial court judge, David Ramsay. In the end, he pleaded guilty to 5 counts: sexual assault causing bodily harm, breach of trust, and 3 counts of buying sex from a person under 18. His victims were mostly Aboriginal girls. I've already talked about, our history with the RCMP, with child welfare, with residential schools, with the church, with the state's policies. And now here sitting in front of me was a young woman talking about this 60-something-year-old sitting provincial court judge, white guy, buying sex from her and her friends and how violent he was with them. He was charged. His victims were between 12 and 16 years old. He was sentenced to 7 years in jail, and he died there in the Dorchester Penitentiary as an untreated sex offender. You might have heard the name Ed Berry. Does anybody in the room know that name? He's also from Prince George. He was the highest ranking MCFD employee in Prince George, and he lost his job after he'd spent years with his wife being a foster parent. He'd spent years being somebody that worked with children in care. He'd been a manager for the public guardian and trustee. He'd been on the board of accreditation of social workers in BC, and he was then the highest ranking member of the MCFD in Prince George. And he was arrested when somebody found his laptop and found images of child pornography on it. How people are supported, how people are connected, how people are protected from accountability in this country is also a part of a story that needs to be told. And it's a difficult story because we don't want to believe that about people. But recently in the paper, you might have heard of a guy named Robert Riley Saunders as well, a social worker in Kelowna, who opened joint bank accounts with kids that were on independent living and then used their money for his personal gain, allegedly. He's been charged. When children are telling you about things that are happening, I really hope that in your training, your first step is to believe. So why is it important that we have culturally safe practices with Indigenous women and girls? Not just because we've lost our roles around colonization, not just because we've lost our power through the Indian Act. In this country, when they took away our traditional systems of governance and imposed this Indian Act legislation and this imposed chief and council on us, in this country, women weren't even allowed to vote, Indigenous women, until 1951. I was born in 1961. The year before that, my dad finally got the vote here in this country as an Indigenous person, just in 1960. So, as a helper, there's 6 questions that I want you to ask yourself. How have you learned about the ways in which colonization differentially impacts or affects Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous people in Canada? And who taught you? It's a really important question. I just did a presentation to a nursing class. I'm not going to say at which university, but they're all first-year nurses. And after I started talking about some of these things, one of the first-year nurses turned to me, and in front of all of her colleagues, I think there was about 120, she said, "Shelley, I heard that Indigenous people don't feel pain in the same way that white people do." This is a first-year nursing student, and this happened about 6 weeks ago in this province. And as I was regrouping and thinking, how am I going to answer and how am I going to swallow all of this anger that is coming up in me right now, one of my colleagues stepped forward, a nursing prof, and she said, "Oh, it's probably because they didn't need any kind of anesthetic when they were doing experiments on them, or in the residential school when the dental students would come, or when they were in Indian hospitals and they didn't need anesthetic in the way that we did." That's my colleague. Racism, bias, not knowing, that's alive and well in a lot of our systems today. So, second, how do the ways in which I'm working help to build respectful relationships between Indigenous people and me? consciously to think about how it is that you go about doing that. How is that done? What's helpful? What isn't helpful? What's your role as a helper in the relationship with Indigenous people, and what are your responsibilities? I ask that question because as a little child, I remember being told all of the time, Shelley, your role, by my grandparents, by my mother, by my father, your role, Shelley, is to be a helper. That's your purpose in life. That's my responsibility. I know that. So, what's your responsibility? Are you fulfilling your role and obligation to Indigenous people in ways that are culturally relevant? And is it meaningful to them? Have you asked them, is what I'm doing helpful to you? What might be more helpful? What are you contributing or giving back to the relationship between Indigenous people and me in the sharing, growth, and learning that's taking place? Is it reciprocal? Again, that's some of our teachings. To be respectful, to always think about reciprocity in our relationship. I work at an institution on unceded territory. I do work with Indigenous people at their request. I bring what I can to that relationship. I do that because I'm living on their unceded territory. If you're living on unceded territory in this province, what are you doing to give back to the Indigenous people that have given so much for us to be here? And finally, how have previous helpers been experienced by the Indigenous person you're working with and helping to build a relationship with? Asking what has happened, what's happened here in the community, and then listening. Be quiet and listening. There's just one little thing. I'm going to ask the person to come up. I want to show you a 2-minute clip. And this is when I worked at Musqueam Indian Band, those issues, or when I worked at UBC and worked with Musqueam Indian Band, asking people what you can do to help and how that might look. Could you bring that up? I'm just going to share a little bit about it. You're going to see a clip of a research project that I was involved with Musqueam Indian Band. And again, it's all that about being respectful, thinking about what's relevant to the people that you're working with, thinking about what you can contribute in terms of reciprocity and your responsibility as a person living on their territory. I had a student at UVic, her name was Karina Sparrow, and she was in a social work class that I was teaching. When she finished her degree, I asked her to come and work with me at the agency in Victoria. And then when I got hired at, can you scroll that down? Again, we did this before and it worked. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I'll just start that when I'm ready. Thank you. When I was hired at UBC, Karina got hired at Musqueam to come home and help the people there. And we'd had a relationship for about 15 years at that time. We went for coffee, and she was telling me about some of the issues that were coming up in Musqueam and how people were dealing with issues that negatively affected youth and women in the community. And I said to her, what does your community need? And I thought she was going to talk about programs and services and supports. And she said, what we need is a canoe. She said, we need a new canoe family, and we need to get our people back out on our traditional highways. We need to help teach our youth how to build those ocean-going canoes again, because that's our identity. And if that is not part of our identity anymore, and that's not part of our experience, then what will that mean for our people in the community? That big piece of us is missing. And so she said, this is what I want to see. And she said, I said, well, how can I help? Remember, I'm from Saskatchewan. And she said, well, we want to build an ocean-going canoe, and we want to train our young people. We want to send them out on tribal journeys. We want to build a carving shed in our community, and then we want to tell people what we did. And I said, that sounds great. How much is that going to cost? And she said, about $500,000. And I said, right, thinking I don't have $500,000. And she said, well, if it drops in your lap one day, just give me a call. And I thought, right. I went back to my office at UBC. I sat down on the computer, I turned it on, and the very first line was a call for proposals up to $500,000 for community-based research. The importance of spirit, the importance of listening, not figuring out how we're going to get to the end line, but as we go along. So I sent her the email and said, I've never written a proposal this big, but if you guys will help me, we can do this. The money had to flow through a university. This is the project. I'm just going to show you a short little clip.
Ossium, Itse Luaya, Karina Sparrow, Quinnisqui. This day has been a long time coming. I'm just going to take it in for a minute. Just wanted to share a little bit about how this project began. I was asked to come home to Musqueam 3 years ago to be a support person and to work with the children and the families here. So I came here as a helper. And within the first 2 weeks that I was here, I mostly did a lot of talking and listening with the families and the community members and the elders. 2 weeks after, I was sitting down having a cup of coffee with a really dear friend of mine and colleague, Shelley Johnson, who's working at UBC. Shelley turns to me and says, so, what does your community need? So I shared with her about what I had heard, what the people here were saying, about their hope and dream to reconnect our young people to our culture and to our teachings and to our values, to help our young people learn the language and learn what it means to be strong Musqueam people. That they wanted our young people back on our traditional highways, back on the river, back on the ocean where we belong, as the chief was saying, as a canoeing community. They wanted something that our young people could be proud of again. So I told Shelley when she asked me that question, I said, we need a canoe. And we need a new canoe family and our young people to go back onto the water.
When Karina, I'm just going to skip through. This project was a 4-year project funded by SSHRC. And like I said, I came from Saskatchewan, and my dad always laughs. He said, what's a person from a small reserve in Saskatchewan doing heading up an ocean-going canoeing project on the west coast of Canada? He said, that can only happen in academia. The issue with it is, though, this is what the Musqueam people said was important to them, to deal with all of the things that had come into their lives around colonization. A way to bring back the culture, a way to bring back the tradition, a way to bring back the language, and to continue that work. So we hired people to carve the canoe in the community and to teach other people how to do that. We videotaped everything. Musqueam's given us permission to use this short video clip. But what it resulted in was the very first canoe carved in Musqueam in 35 years. 35 years. And the day that it went out on the water onto the Fraser and made a circle up with at the Pacific Ocean and came back, I was standing on the beach at Musqueam with about 400 people. And I was standing with grown men in their 60s and 70s, absolutely crying, because they said that they never thought that they would live long enough to see that happen in their community again. And the return of identity. I'm just going to show a little piece of that day. This is our chief carver, Elmer Sampson. He was 87 years old, between the time we wrote the proposal and it was funded, Elmer's colleague in the community, Chief Ernie Campbell, he died. He was going to be our chief carver, so we had to ask Elmer to come over from the island to do that. And this was the 100th canoe that he'd carved. Elmer passed away shortly after the completion of it. He was 87 years old. And I'm just going to ask, is there anybody here from the Chemainus First Nation? Anybody at all? Okay, that's good, because in their territory, you're not to show pictures to people from their community of people that have passed away for a year. Told me that this is an important issue for Musqueam people to have your own canoe and have a carving. So this is the day that it was launched, and this is the blessing of the canoe. There's Karina front and center, two-spirit person that the community identified to take the lead role in the canoe.
Before they use it, put in the water. But I was asking if they got anybody here to do that when they're done. When they put it out in the bush where they build it, they use some of those saplings. When the sap's running this time of year, they take it off and it's real slippery. So that's what they use, just run the glue on. It's like oil.
I think it's really fitting that Karina took the position at the front of the canoe. In our teachings, two-spirit people have special roles and responsibilities in our community, and they're around healing and teaching. So I just want to say, no matter where you're standing, there's something that you can do to help people deal with this history and ongoing colonization in our families and in our communities. I encourage you to think about not just the partner and violence, but also the systemic violence that you may or may not have learned or been taught about in your education. There's a lot more for all of us to understand in this country to get it to a place where we can all be proud to be a part. Thank you for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Miigwech.